I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with a small print, and today my guest is Brooks Spector. Brooks, on this show, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they like to be introduced. So over to you. Who are you? What do you do? Where are you in the world? What do you care about? What do you want people to know about you?
Well, it's good to be with you, Bronwyn. Brooks Spector is my name. I'm a retired American diplomat. I live in South Africa now because my wife told me I had to, because she's from here. So we made a choice, and as I retired, we just stayed. And the key word there is retired. And what that means is I was free to do things that I wanted to do, which is a lot more writing and eventually some television and some radio and some thinking. And I like to say, when people say, what is my job? I usually say general layabout, but that obviously is a lie. We pay attention to lots of different things. 2 cats, 2 children, house in Johannesburg, apartment in Cape Town. And we pay attention to what's going on in South Africa, in the US, and the rest of the world.
And that's why we invited you here. We want to take a look today at the connections between what's going on in South Africa and what's going on in America and the rest of the world, because there are, of course, connections. Everything is connected in this world that we have. No man is an island. There's no real Robinson Crusoe economies or political economies out there. And we kind of have to pay attention to what's going on outside of our borders, sometimes to make sense of what's going on within them. So let's start right about there. America has had an exciting week in politics, almost as exciting as any given week in South Africa. I mean, our political television, parliamentary TV is some of the most world-class entertainment you can get out there. But America's had quite the couple of weeks, from attempted assassinations to last-minute switcheroos of the Democratic lineup. There's a lot going on and quite a lot at stake when it comes to the future, not just of America, but of the rest of the world too. So maybe from your perspective, from your distinct perspective, on the other side of the world, looking back home at the USA, what is your take on what's gone down, the particular level of chaos going on in America at the moment?
It's a good question. It's good. It's if 2 weeks ago you had asked that question or made that statement, it would have been possible to say the American political universe was edging toward boredom and terror. 2 old guys were going to fight it out to be in charge of a country which was at least a generation and a half, 2 generations younger than they were. And then suddenly, the whole universe tipped over in America. The one was the victim, or the intended victim anyway, of an assassination attempt. That's the case of Donald Trump. And then Joe Biden, after weeks of agonizing on the part of the members of his party, elected officials, and just ordinary people, at his dismal performance in the first debate with Donald Trump, he finally elected to put country and party over Joe Biden and decided that he would stand down from being a presidential candidate while staying president until the next term begins, and giving way to his vice president, an individual who, let's start with the categories of things. She's a generation younger than he is. She is a she. There are 2 children, 2 stepchildren in her family. And the thing that has caught many people's attention is that she's not white by the standard definition of the term. One parent is from Jamaica, and one parent was from South Asia. And the end result is people are having a little bit of trouble categorizing her, which is something of a piece with the way the country is changing too. There are lots more mixed marriages and blended families now than there have ever been. And in a funny kind of way, she decided to become a kind of African American. She went to high school in Canada. Then she moved back to the United States with her mother. And then she went to Howard University, which is the first historically Black college and university in the United States, where she self-identified with friends who were clearly African American. And then she went to the University of California in San Francisco Law School, where many of the students were other than white. And then moving along through various jobs, prosecutor and then attorney general for the state of California and senator, she was initially picked for Joe Biden's vice presidency, partly because she balanced the ticket. The younger, more melanin contented individual and being female. And now suddenly she stepped out into the sunlight on her own, and she's had this whirlwind of good vibes from many, many people. And an extraordinary amount of money has been raised for her candidacy. And it's almost as if Joe Biden has been already put into history in the book and then back on the shelf. He's barely been visible, and he's barely made any public comments. And Kamala Harris is all over the landscape. She's become a commodity in popular culture in a way which nobody would have expected. She's now this phenomena that I had never heard of because I'm too old, I guess. The summer brat phenomena. She's now part of it. And I'm going to have to call one of my daughters and have one of them explain to me what this is. But Kamala Harris is in the videos, and she's lip syncing some of the lyrics. It's just an astonishing thing. And the Republicans, the other party, managed to put their foot in it rather badly. Their new vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who had written a very interesting memoir 8 years ago, Hillbilly Elegy, and there was obviously a movie made out of it 4 years ago as well. Vance said she's not the right person because she doesn't have any children of her own. She's an old lady with cats. And immediately millions of American women have risen up to say, yeah, I'm the cat lady, and we're coming to get you. Which is, this whole thing is just emblematic of a new twist in the culture war.
You point to that. I mean, she's at the intersection of a lot of intersectionality. You can put it that way. That's clearly obvious. But given her past performance, which is, of course, no indication of future results, but in the past, America has been more open-minded to racial diversity when it comes to political leadership than, shall we say, gender diversity. Even to the point that you ended up with a Trump versus a Hillary, and Trump came out the winner, which is quite extraordinary to many of us sort of bystanders. Why is it you think that women in politics in the US are still so regressive? And is this actually, I mean, you mentioned like the brat girl summer and the young women and older women rallying around Kamala, but is this actually a strength in terms of winning at the polls, or is it not? I ask purely as a pragmatist, not from any particular point of value here, but just based on the actual cultural context of the United States project.
Well, I mean, it's good that you mentioned the Hillary Clinton adventure because the U.S. has this unusual way of figuring out who will be the president. Yes, people vote, and they vote by state, but then the cumulative weight of each state's population determines whether that state's electoral count gets added to column A or column B. And so in point of Hillary Clinton actually gained more popular votes than Donald did. And that to me is an often overlooked bit of the texture of these things. If 78,000 people in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had chosen to vote for Hillary Clinton, 78,000, about enough to fill up a decent football stadium. If that number of people had voted for her, or if another 78,001 people had voted for her, she would have been the president, and we would have been looking now at the end, perhaps, of the second term of Hillary Clinton president. But the larger question is true that although women represent, 50.9% of the population or something close to that, they have been in a inferior position politically for a long time. There have been no Margaret Thatchers or Prime Minister Gandhi or Golda Meirs in American politics. There have been women who've had enormous influence within a presidency. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, was often seen as Franklin Roosevelt's most important confidential advisor. But then, of course, he saw her every day, and she told him what she thought, and he better listen. But over time, there have been a growing number of women who have won electoral office in the United States as governors, as senators, as congresswomen, not in the percentage totals that would have been clear from simple population statistics. But I think we have crossed that Rubicon this time around, because most of the commentary, except from really, sort of sour grapes approaches from the Republican candidates, has basically ignored the fact that this is a male versus female race, and more whether or not she's qualified to run or whether or not she'll be a good president. Now, all right, the subliminal version of is she qualified also says, and after all, she's just a woman to some people.
Who's qualified? I mean, we've seen your past presidents. What does qualified mean in this context? Qualified means popular.
Well, qualified in the sense of I don't like her politics and I don't like her policies and I don't like her positions very much, so therefore she's unqualified. And that's how you demonize your opponent that way, and you make them lesser rather than equal to you. But the truth is that Donald Trump is now, it's got to be said, he's running scared from this. For quite a while, he was able to say, I'm going to defeat this tired old man who can't remember his name and doesn't remember where he is, and he falls down the steps. And now suddenly Donald Trump is the old guy who has, who constantly issues statements that resemble, sort of random words, or, the words that come out of one of those games in which, Pictionary or something. You don't get the sense that he was absolutely clear on what he said, and then his running mate has this curious retrograde illusion of let's go back to the 1950s when women were in the kitchen and took care of children and have a job and everything was great and wonderful. Never mind that that was never quite the truth anyway, but that's the vision. But your larger point is true, that American politics has largely been the province of men, and it has largely been the province of men who have a faithful helpmate standing 1.5 steps behind them, often now in recent years holding a child and looking for all the world like they are just exactly designed to be the person who will soothe the afflicted and and heal the wounded, but not issue policy, not be in charge. But there are lots of female governors and senators and congressmen, and arguably, for years, one of the 2 or 3 most influential politicians in America was Nancy Pelosi, who was Speaker of the House or House Minority Leader for years, and she ran the Democratic Party like it had never been run before. The Democratic Party is usually seen as a large bag of angry cats with the opening tied shut and somebody giving it a poke. But she made sure that the Congress stayed with her on most issues and most deals. And when she made a deal, by golly, it stuck, because she came out of a political family. Her father was a mayor in Baltimore in a machine politics environment, but she was in California, and she ran the Congress in a lot of ways, and so that has made her She's still in Congress, but it's made her a role model for a lot of younger women who've gone into politics. Be like Nancy Pelosi, or in some cases, be like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, perhaps, who recently passed away, Supreme Court Justice, who was female.
Okay, so your perspective is perhaps America is ready to be nice to women. I mean, like lots of the policies that are currently in place, that have been in place in the past, sort of point in the other direction, that America just doesn't really like women all that much, not when it comes to politics and policy. But assuming we can get over that we are ready to be more diverse and all the rest of it, and the voters are ready to try something new on the menu, having sampled the other fare and perhaps found it not entirely to their liking in the past. Let's look forward to the future. And from your perspective, what are the sorts of policies that the world could look forward to with a new woman in the White House? And I ask that as a curiously interested but yet disenfranchised African, like much of the global South. As mean as Trump was to the rest of the world, Joe Biden wasn't awfully nice to us either. I mean, he's stolen years worth of our retirement funds with his quantitative easing that we will never get back, and enriched his own people for the privilege at the same time. And in purely economic terms, not that many people have connected those dots, but that's the bald reality. I'm quite interested from your perspective, what does Kamala presidency, should it transpire, should she even secure the official nomination, because that's still kind of up for grabs this week, as far as I understand, although it does seem like it's an almost done deal. What are the sorts of policies that we can look forward to that have a global impact, both in terms of economy and, of course, in terms of geopolitics? I mean, Trump was a really interesting case when he was in charge. He made strides for peace in the Middle East, but at the same time antagonized whole entire different swaths of the planet, causing chaos in his wake. Is Kamala's sort of geopolitical stance a bit more focused, a bit less, shall we say, laissez-faire and spontaneous? What are the sorts of policies we can look forward to there? Who are the friends? Who are the foes? Who gets the money? What happens with Ukraine? Who do they back in terms of Gaza going forward? And what are they going to do in terms of the money? Is it going to be good or bad for the Global South Incorporated?
We've got about 3 hours for this, right?
Yeah, no problem.
Two footnotes to what you just said. I mean, I would define the Trump presidency as chaotically transactional. You never knew from one day to the next what was going to happen.
Anything could happen.
and sometimes anything did. That was the problem.
Yeah. Bad for certainty, which is bad for investment, yes.
Yeah, but it was largely transactional. I'll do this if you'll do that, but if you don't do that, by golly, we're going to do this. And that may well work in the real estate market in New York City, but it's not exactly the way the world is put together in many aspects.
It's the opposite of the European way of doing business. I mean, they must have just been absolutely horrified. Well, those conservatives that run the other half of the world.
I mean, the European way of doing business now is rather different than the European way of doing business 60 years ago. Let's put it that way, or 80 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago. I mean, they've evolved in a particular kind of way, in part because there's more of a European perspective than there is a French, German, British, Italian, Austrian perspective. I mean, they have no choice in the matter. They have at least for many of the countries, there's a single monetary authority, and a lot of the policies on trade are developed in some anonymous building in Brussels rather than individual capitals.
The world is a strange place.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's okay. And European politicians like to run against those anonymous bureaucrats in Belgium too, in Brussels, in the EU buildings. But as to what Kamala Harris should she see, I even did that. What would she do if she won? Let's get this pronoun business sorted here. A lot of it will be similar to the Biden presidency, in part because she's had 4 years of being part of the Biden presidency, and she was picked because she was not necessarily all that different from what the president she was part of the administration of had set out. there is, let's take the economic areas first. There is an increasingly protectionist texture in politics in the United States. And this is whether you're Republican or Democrat these days. The Trump administration saw tariffs and protectionism as a cudgel that you could whack another country with to get it to shape up and fall in line. The Biden administration saw it more as a way of nurturing, encouraging, and supporting industries and industrial sectors in the U.S. that would help maintain the country's or rebuild the country's dominance, depending on how you want to look at it, in a particular area or sector, or to stake out territory in new industries. So there's a philosophical difference in a way, I think, that isn't always reflected in the specifics of the policy, but where it comes from, I think, is a little different.
So similar effect, but the one is based on local carrots and the other one is based in international sticks. So
that's a reasonable shorthand way to throw that around, because the Biden administration, consistent with previous Democratic administrations and the philosophy of this kind of policies that Democratic presidents have followed, is usually, how should we put it, is usually a little more pro-worker and a little less pro-business than Republicans are. But pro-worker has a pro-business element to it, obviously. I mean, if there's no company, there's no workers. So you have to sort of accept the fact that it's two parts of the same half, the same whole. Excuse, not half. It's two halves of the same whole. In foreign policy, we can sort of take them in sequence. A Harris administration would try hard to carry out similar policies with Ukraine. That is, full support of its military capabilities and its economic stability, and at the same time push hard with the Russians in some way to finally say, okay, you can declare victory if you want, but let's end this thing, and let's bring this to a halt. With China, it's a little bit more complex, because China is, after all, China and the US together are a huge trading combine. But it's one.
People think that China is separate from the US, that you can pick one, but meanwhile, no, the monster has two faces.
Well, I mean, a couple of years ago, people were writing journal articles that started out with the phrase "Chimerica." Where is it going?
Yes, and that was a much more honest take than many of the takes now that seem to delude readers of popular business publications into thinking that they can take one without the other.
No, you can't really. I mean, so much of what is made anywhere in the world now has well, it's not just China, of course. I mean, if you buy something of any value-added quality, there are going to be components in it from Bangladesh and Malaysia and Indonesia, the Philippines and China and Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, and probably in a few years, Chile and Senegal and Kenya as well. And the problem for Americans is that whole industrial sectors have ended up more Chinese than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Chinese electric vehicles are becoming a big thing in East Asia, yes. They're not really a huge thing in America yet, because there are competitive versions in the United States. But in a lot of the world, a Chinese EV is a status symbol. Go around the streets in South Africa, how many Havals do you see these days? Quite a few. And a lot of them are increasingly going to be EVs from China. But remember too that the computer chips that run all these things, many of them come from not China and not even the United States. Many of them come from Taiwan. And at the highest end of the computer chip universe, many of them come from Taiwan. And so that leads you to the reality that the US-China relationship is increasingly focused on a strategic question of what happens with and to Taiwan. The Chinese have never agreed that Taiwan was an independent country, and Taiwan doesn't claim its independence. The territorial status is, if you had to describe it precisely, its sovereignty remains in dispute. But for all intents and purposes, Taiwan acts as if it were an independent country, but just never says so. At the same time, the US has pledged to provide for its defense in many ways, including military sales, and a kind of a gauzy, not quite definitive statement about defending Taiwan were to be attacked. And the only place that would attack it logically is going to be China, if it were to happen. So the American position has always been, certainly in recent years, strategic ambiguity, which is supposed to deter others from doing something because they can't quite figure out what it is you would do in return. You know, I might punch you, or I might not, but you'll never know until we find out, kind of thing. All right, so the China relationship is going to have to be, because it's not going to go away. It's going to have to become some more sophisticated version of supporting domestic markets and domestic industries and advanced industries, even as trade with China continues. Because you can't go into a store in the United States that sells anything that isn't made or in whole or in part in China. But if you went to Iowa, for example, that state in the center of the country that most South Africans can't find on a map, more of its crop in soybeans and corn stroke maize is sold to China than it is sold to the United States. That's because the Chinese have an infinite capacity, in effect, for improving their stocks of food. So soybeans, which are an important part of the Chinese diet, corn, which is largely animal feed, but also chicken parts, increasingly exported from the United States. And so you end up with trade wars over things like phytosanitary sanctions and whether or not certain kinds of growth hormones have been put into the animal while it is still alive, and how do you measure it, and how do you account for whether it's safe or not safe, and all the rest of it. So those are always levers in sort of trade conflict. Okay, with Russia now, Russia being the aggressor in the Ukraine conflict, the Americans, together with many European allies, not everyone, and a number of East Asian nations, have put into effect a whole series of increasingly strenuous and dire sanctions against Russia to make the cost of its war increasingly untenable. Sanctions aren't going to prevent a Russian withdrawal of the military, but the decline in the economy might. Now, the ultimate threat, so far at least, has been the idea that that enormous hoard of Russian hard currency assets that are held in the West, in banks in the US or Britain or on the continent of Europe, could be put in escrow or even seized as a way of saying, all right, you want to keep fighting this war? This is how it's going to cost you. And that money will be put in escrow for the rebuilding of Ukraine once this war is over. Now, that's the kind of the nuclear option at this point in the world of sanctions with Russia. But the relationship between the US and Russia is some people say it's about as bad as it's been during the Cold War, except that there aren't armies facing each other. So, that's not a good sign. Now, shift to East Asia outside of China, there are an increasing, there are two sets of interlocking sort of alliances that have been put in place to reestablish an American, not necessarily the word dominance, but counterbalance to the Chinese weight. One is the world's most awkward acronym, AUKUS, which I wish they had found something a little better than that. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, AUKUS. But then the Indian participation in a relationship is growing, and of course there is a continuing security relationship with South Korea and with Japan. And the reason why all these are important is the security and stability of the the Indian Ocean basin and the near to East Asian waters, South China Sea, Malacca Strait, and so forth, where I forget the exact number, and I'm sorry, but it's something like 60% of the world's total aggregate trade passes through that region, which means that it's worth it to maintain the stability of sea routes and innocent passage and non-interference with commercial traffic. And that, of course, has a security component, and this is where the American position is heading, whether it would have been a Biden administration or presumably a Harris administration. With the Trump administration, we go back to the chaotic transactionism. We're not going to help you unless you pay up, whatever pay up means. And I'm at a loss to try to explain precisely how to define that. Now, I saved the best for the last two, I guess. One is Africa, and this brings us to the often heard and usually misunderstood acronym AGOA, another one of those acronyms that doesn't actually ring in the ear nicely. African Growth and Opportunity Act. This was trade law passed by the United States. People think it's a treaty, and it isn't, but it's American unilateral legislation that allows a couple thousand products from Africa, totally duty-free entrance in the massive American market. A lot of African countries have not benefited by it very much because they haven't produced the kinds of products that people want to buy, or they haven't developed mechanisms to export them reliably. South Africa's actually benefited fairly well by it. Most of the other countries that have done nicely on this have been energy producers, petroleum and natural gas. But South Africa has managed to penetrate US markets with a couple of interesting products, value-added agricultural products, including things like frozen fruit dessert kinds of things, and everybody's favorite, wine. South African wines are getting a growing toehold in America, but also things like automobiles. South Africa exports automobiles to the United States, and automobile parts. Really good high-end luxury automobile leather seats are made in this country and end up in the American market, and for assembly into American-made foreign cars. That's a weird term, but you know what I mean. And so if the AGOA preference for South Africa were to end, the law comes up for renewal in 2025, next year, and it has Congress has to either renew it as it is, renew it with major changes, or simply not bother with it. If it doesn't bother with it, then a lot of companies in this country are going to find their circumstances rather more precarious than it was last year. And the discussion, the debate in the Congress now, among at least Republican members of the House and some Senate, is whether or not South Africa should still be able to maintain its member status as an AGOA nation. Now, why? Two reasons. One, it's tended to piss off the United States with some of its foreign policy decisions on the Middle East as one, and its friendship and love and affection and warmth with Russia, and to some degree with China. And the apogee of this probably was on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. South Africa decided that it was appropriate to have a joint military exercise with South Africa and China with naval vessels in the Indian Ocean, which infuriated a lot of Americans who pay attention.
Completely accidental, I'm sure.
Oh no, I mean, it was just that one was using the Gregorian, the other one was using the Julian calendar, who knows? But that really, was a stick in the eye for a lot of people. And the expressed neutrality in the Ukraine-Russia conflict is yet another poke. But the biggest poke
there is that more, especially the Ukraine issue, is that something that more offends the average Republican sentiment or the average Democrat sentiment in the US? Like, what are the various parties' ideas when it comes to both the Ukrainian conflict and the Gaza conflict, which has become globally politicized at the moment and become a sort of party fraction line point too. So in that regard, given South Africa's, shall we say, schizophrenic and completely hypocritical foreign policy stance on those two policies, who are we offending more when it comes to internal party dynamics in the US?
Well, you're offending it. It's sort of an equal opportunity offender in a way.
Yeah, I mean, we've managed to make no friends and influence no people with our particular approach.
I like to say that decisions that you take politically or international relations terms or even economically, decisions are made by sovereign nations, but these decisions have consequences. I mean, you don't operate in a vacuum. Once you've decided to do something, then the other country that you've offended or annoyed or threatened has the right, the reason, and the opportunity to say, well, so since you've done that, this is how we're going to respond.
Yeah. And so I'm just interested which party we should be more afraid of offending when it comes to things like AGOA and, of course, some of the other sort of trade ideas that might put us into the naughty corner, things like US aid that might be diverted elsewhere. Which party do we have more to fear of due to offending them based on our current, almost Trumpian, ironically, stance on global politics?
Well, in terms of AGOA, the Republicans are the ones who've gotten madder at you because this is something that is well within the congressional purview, and they have the ability to say no or yes to. And it's, as I was saying, that there are two parts to the AGOA puzzle. One is the policies that a country takes, both internally and externally. Supposing you had a rapacious, despotic dictatorship that also in the process sided visibly and vociferously with the Russians, and that would sort of clean the deck of all the possibilities, because AGOA requires demonstrations of movement toward democracy and transparency in government and so forth. But the other half of it is if the country has reached middle income status, is AGOA still the right vehicle for help? I mean, if you're manufacturing luxury automobiles, are you still an emerging market, a growing third world country kind of? You drive around this country, you see a lot of rather expensive vehicles. But for AGOA's purposes, you have more to fear from the Republicans, I think. Democratic administrations tend to be to have a slightly more favorable smile toward Africa than Republicans do. You recall Donald Trump's infamous description of African countries, which is a family program, right? We shouldn't say it, huh? But he did in public.
You don't know what we're talking about. How about that?
It starts with an S and ends with a T, and that obviously was not either a kind fair or a reasonable explanation. The Ukraine is a slightly different thing. Republicans have a sort of a split personality on Ukraine.
You're South African again.
Yeah. I mean, the traditional Republican view would have been the old interventionist, oppose the Soviet Union in all fronts and all ways. They would have been, 110% in favor of helping Ukraine in any way possible. But a new isolationist America first, we don't need to help countries that are far away, of which we know little. Thank you, Neville Chamberlain, for your excellent description of how things should be. Republicans are split. The part of them wants that we're not involved anymore. It's all way over there somewhere. We got to figure out a way to deal with this, but it's not our problem. And some Republicans who still have that old fervor in them, we have to defend, support, and help. But they're also budget hawks. And so they're saying, when we spend all this money on the Ukrainians, and what do we get for it? Democrats, on the other hand, so far at least, most of them have been supportive of Ukraine and aiding Ukraine. So that's where the landscape is. Middle East is even more complicated because it isn't just the Middle East problem. It's a whole series of separate problems that overlap with each other. Take them in sequence going from east to west. Iran. Iran is everybody's favorite bad guy in America. It's hard to find somebody who's supportive of the Iranian regime and its foreign policy activities and the way in which it aids and abets a whole range of Islamicist parties and militias scattered all over the landscape. And the Iranians keep threatening that now that the six-party agreement on their nuclear development is effectively null and void because the Americans left it. Crazy idea that it would work better if they weren't part of it, but never mind. They are, by most experts' evaluations, a couple of months away from assembling enough material to make an actual nuclear device. Now, marrying the device to the missiles they have on hand and targeting it properly is a whole different set of issues, and that maybe they're further down the road. But the fact that they are arming and helping Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen is enough to make pretty much everybody in America unhappy with them. You move to Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, no paragon of democracy and transparency and free expression, although women can drive in Saudi Arabia now. They're not allowed to vote yet, I don't believe, but they can drive. Whether they do is a different question. The Americans go hot cold on Saudi Arabia, and I'm not sure it's a party issue as much as just a more general, we're not sure what our relationship with Saudi Arabia should be. I mean, ideally, I think Americans would love to see the Saudis put as much pressure as they can on those that Americans do not like, maintain the price of petroleum at the lowest possible level for the maximum amount of production and consumption, and at the same time support visibly, actually, some sort of a larger Middle East peace process that involves the Israelis and the West Bank and Gaza, and boxes out of the equation groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. And you should add, of course, that the Saudis had been involved in supporting the Yemen government against the Houthi rebels, which the Iranians have been supporting. So now you see all the different threads overlapping. You come to Israel in the center of at least part of this. Traditionally, historically, and fairly consistently, support for Israel in American politics has been almost universal. There are outliers on it, and there are conditions in the minds of some people, but with most, with few exceptions, most American politicians at the federal level sort of almost automatically express support for Israel, but not necessarily anymore support for the Netanyahu government or its precise policies in Gaza. And there is where the trouble begins, because the policies that the Netanyahu government has carried out in Gaza have engendered a large and growing amount of more than dissatisfaction, more than disapproval, close on to enmity on the part of a growing number of Americans about the way in which it has been carried out. Never mind that the Israelis had self-defense justifications for dealing with the initial October 7 attack. The way that they have moved forward, to many Americans, and a large number of them, seems unbalanced. And you saw that in a very explicit kind of way on college campuses all across the country. Now, that wasn't necessarily an example that everybody in the country feels that way. I mean, a couple hundred demonstrators in college A and 1,000 in college B and so forth is not the same as saying in a plebiscite of the whole country, everybody feels something. But it's pretty hard to find at this point people who are unconditionally supportive of the way the Netanyahu government has been conducting itself. And part of it, I think, is because of the way in which he, in particular, has felt that he can meddle in American political discourse rather easily and effectively. The Republicans have his back for the most part, and he feels that he can push an American president whichever way he wants to. The Trump administration took a series of discrete acts recognizing the effective annexation of the Golan Heights, moving the capital, the recognized capital, and thus the embassy to Jerusalem, which up until that time had been considered something that very few countries would have done because of the nature of the not region. For many politicians, Donald Trump represents the high level of support. We have to remember that the Israelis have a political system too, and that Netanyahu has always got to watch his back domestically, because there are 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, and probably 90% of them or more are Netanyahu supporters and the two parties on the far right. And without those, he loses his parliamentary majority and thus is no longer prime minister. And then guess what? He's subject to courtroom issues over corruption charges. Going forward in a Harris administration, you'll notice, and I think this was a real straw in the wind, find a better metaphor, but you know what I mean. When Netanyahu came to deliver a speech to the joint session of the US Congress, it's the fourth time he's done it, which is extraordinary in its own way. The vice president is usually the chairman of such sittings, and she, Kamala Harris, as vice president, chose not to be there. I think that was a visible statement of what it was she did not approve of.
That's quite big.
I thought so.
Then again, this is what this whole season of politics has been. It's been a whole lot of the impossible becoming possible. We saw that in South Africa with our coalition government, the impossible of the ANC ever losing its outright majority peacefully, suddenly becoming possible and becoming reality. And we get used to that new reality quite quickly. Your season 2, the impossibility of another Trump term, then an assassination suddenly makes him a hero. Then the impossibility of fielding someone like Joe Biden, at the same time, the impossibility of getting rid of him gracefully. And yet suddenly these things have happened, and now they are the new reality. And these swings, as you say, from de facto support of Israel to maybe that's not the case anymore in the new Kamala brat girl summer of politics in the US. Suddenly all these impossibilities become possible, and that makes there's sort of cracks where the future can get in. There's a lot more uncertainty, but I think there's also a lot more, perhaps, shall we say, energy. And to sort of counteract a lot of that global apathy we've seen among voters all across the planet, both again here in South Africa and the US. So overall, a little bit of the change in the odds, or a little bit of uncertainty in the odds, I think could generally be a good thing for people. As much as we tend to think that certainty is good for investors and all the rest of it, certainty is also very good for perpetuating the status quo. So there's always those two sides to these things.
One last little point, something that I know you and your colleagues study in your other circumstances, the issue of how generations change and how they shape the landscape. This is a moment of, in many ways, generational change in the United States.
Yes.
Relatively speaking, it's a much younger country than the European nations, than China, than Japan. Closer
and
to a
much
third.
more ethnically diverse, because so much of that youth is actually coming not from the majority settler community, whatever language you want to use. It's not just white American people anymore. It's a much more diverse youth that you're looking at there.
And even the putative successor in the MAGA world, Donald Trump's Make America Great World, is a 39-year-old man in the name of J.D. Vance. 39. He's had a year and a half of political experience, and he's now running for vice president. So whichever way you look,
diverse wife and family too. He's also not
yes, very, very much so. The diversity is, you're absolutely right. I probably didn't emphasize that quite enough. There, more and more states will become minority majority states. Hawaii already is. California is virtually at the point. New Mexico, I believe, has crossed the threshold, and it's coming for lots of other states. Minority majority. That means collectively African American, Asian, Hispanic American, Pacific Islander, Native American together are representing more than the still a plurality of white Americans, and as well as mixed marriages, blended families, the whole range of things. Even the Census Bureau has started to add new categories to take a recognition of this massive change in the way the country's put together.
Absolutely. Change. It's exciting, but it's the one thing we can kind of expect going ahead. Thank you for giving us some points to think about how the changes in the US could impact us globally, since we all are global citizens, first and foremost, despite our arbitrary national borders that do cause a lot of real world consequences for all of us. They are still just effectively imaginary lines drawn in our very real sand. But nonetheless, things that happen over there affect us over here, and vice versa, if only to a slightly smaller degree, given our relative power and privilege in this world. But Brooks, thank you very much for your time and giving us things to think about. If people want to continue the conversation, read more about your work, whatever you're doing in the various different multimedia spaces where you have a presence, where you listen, lurk, speak out, and contribute to the conversation too, where can people find you?
Well, most of the writing nowadays is in the Daily Maverick. I try to write 1 or 2 columns a week. And most of the people who do electronic media are very kind, and they sometimes will put a conversation I've been involved in as a YouTube feature. Just Google my name and you'll find all kinds of useful things and other things. We go, oh, what did he say? What did he mean? What is he talking about?
And if people want to communicate with you, are you on any of the are you on the interwebs?
I'm pretty active with Facebook, and I'm certainly happy to connect with people there. And I probably shouldn't hand out my email address because that goes everywhere nowadays in all kinds of places.
Contact you via Maverick through the book of the face.
Yeah, but Facebook is fine because it's, if I choose not to answer, I choose not to answer. But my kids chide me because I haven't done all those other things that they're now available with, because I'm not sure the mechanics or where it goes or how it works. But Facebook's fine.
Excellent. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure.
That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement, and that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.